Okay, so we are going to talk today about definition types here, which we started with a little bit the other day with the other PowerPoint that I did. But we're going to go a little bit further today. This is all taken from the book, but I'm basically just going to kind of go over it and then also to expound on it just a little bit. So let's take a look. First, we've got formal definitions, which is basically just what you would find in dictionaries, but it's important when you are writing arguments because it classifies things. So it's useful for setting up a class and then distinguishing it from other members in that class. So for example, if we're talking about the electric car, there's a lot of different types, a lot of different brands, all that kind of thing. Let's say we were looking to buy an electric car, or let's say we were making an argument about whether the Prius or the Tesla is the better car, then we would have to specify all those things. So first of all, they're both an electric car is a passenger vehicle, so that's its class, and it has features that distinguish it from other members in that class. So let's take a look. So there's different types. We've got the plug-in electric vehicles, that's the EVs, and then we've also got hybrids, right? So we've got two different ones. The plugins can plug them into charge from an off-board electric power source. So plugins, they don't have a motor at all, whereas hybrids supplement an internal combustion engine with battery power that cannot be plugged in. So very different. And this can help you decide if you want a Prius or a Tesla. So a Prius is an electrically assisted version of a gasoline car. So there are, some positive and negatives to that. So if you were going to make an argument about it, you might talk about how you might be able to go further in this case. For example, if you're going to travel a lot with it, you don't have to find a place to plug in. You can just switch to gasoline, that kind of thing. And then we've got the Tesla, which is fully electric. It's just a battery. It doesn't have an engine, no motor. And then we might talk about, if we were going to argue in favor of that, we would talk about how, it has the self-driving, and it's also trendy, and you can just plug it in. We're not using any gasoline. So anyway, as you're formulating arguments like this, when we're talking about definitions, this is kind of the way that you would go about it. So you want to kind of be thinking of all these things, and all of these things are, kind of centering on definitions and then making an argument from them. Operational definitions identify an object or idea by what it does or by what conditions create it. So an example might be someone makes an offensive sexual imposition, but to determine whether it's sexual harassment, we have to determine if it was, number one, unwanted, number two, unsolicited, number three, repeated, and then how can the conditions be proven. So this is where sexual harassment cases, which are very common today, then lawyers have to take that into account. So they have to be able to prove those kinds of things. Also, how an operational definition can change depending on the conditions and cause arguments to arise. So first of all, in English, the word collaborator has a double meaning. A colleague can be described as a collaborator in a neutral or a positive sense. Normally, we think of collaborators as being more positive, I think. Collaboration generally means being, we think of it, I think, more often than not as like cooperation. Collaborating with someone means working with them, that kind of thing. But there is another side to this, and this is where an argument might come into play. So the other definition of collaborator relevant here is different. Someone who works with the enemy, with the occupying power, with the dictatorial regime. In this negative sense, collaborator is closely related to another set of words: collusion, complicity, connivance. So now we've got a completely different definition, and this is where we might argue that people who fit this definition then, we can argue for it in the negative. So the negative meaning gained currency during World War II when it was widely used to describe Europeans who cooperated with Nazi occupiers. At base, the ugly meaning of collaborator carries an implication of treason, betrayal of one's nation, of one's ideology, of one's morality, of one's values. So now we could be making an argument against these Europeans who cooperated with Nazi occupiers. Of course, those Europeans themselves might defend it in some way. And, that's where it comes into argument. So operational arguments, again, there can be questions related to conditions, and if we're going to make an operational argument, this is what we have to kind of start thinking about. So first of all, can institutional racism occur in the absence of specific and individual acts of racism? So first we have to define what is institutional racism, and then we have to think about the conditions. In this one, can people be paid for their community service still be called volunteers? This might make a difference in terms of how to classify them, so we have to think about that. Does academic dishonesty occur if a student accepts wording suggested by a writing center tutor? So now we have to define academic dishonesty. And in this case, it's a pretty gray area, right? So we're getting help from a tutor. If they copied it directly, then it might be, but obviously they're getting help. There's a lot of, a lot of questions in there. And now we've got the questions related to fulfillment of conditions. So number one, has an institution supported traditions or policies that have led to widespread racial inequities? That goes back to this first question. That's kind of looking at the circumstances there. Number two, was the compensation given to volunteers really pay or simply reimbursement for expenses? So if it wasn't actual money, then maybe we say, okay, then they are volunteers, because even though they got reimbursement, there wasn't actually money involved. So that would be another way to define that. And number three, did the student actually copy down what the tutor said with the intention of using it? So there, if they actually copied it down word for word and then specifically wrote that down, then maybe. But then we'd have to prove that. We have to look at the situation, and we have to look at how we define academic dishonesty and all that kind of thing, rather than, just a tutor who was trying to help and the student, took that help and then, used it in their paper. So anyway, you can see where there's a lot of gray area in all of this. The conditions make a big difference. You have to prove all these conditions, think about the conditions, think about what you want to say in these types of arguments, all that kind of stuff. Definitions by example. So define a class by listing its individual members. So they want to show what people or things have in common. So one example is, why is Washington, D.C. denied the status of a state? So then we have to think about, okay, what constitutes a state and what does Washington, D.C. not have? What are they lacking there? How does it differ from the other 50 states? So that would be one thing. Another one is, why is the status of planet denied to asteroids when both planets and asteroids are bodies that orbit the sun? So we might say, okay, yeah, that's one way that they're the same, but what is it that's different about asteroids? And so one thing might be their size. Maybe asteroids don't meet size requirements to be considered a planet. So even though they do orbit around the sun like a planet, they're too small to actually be considered a planet. So, and again, there would be a debate there. That's why it's argumentative. Some scientists might say, the size doesn't matter, so to speak. But other scientists would say, well, yeah, it does, because, if we're going to classify what a planet is, we have to look, size is one of the conditions. So anyway, so that's that. So now we're talking about those arguments. And then finally, negative definitions can be really interesting. And you guys are going to read an article about this, which is kind of interesting. And also this might be an option for you in terms of the upcoming essay. So explaining what a person, thing, or concept is by defining what it is not. So for example, in politics, it's used a lot. Strategies of definition play a role in politics as individuals or political groups try to show themselves in the best possible light by saying that what they're not. So they're not radicals, they're not fascists, they're not white supremacists, all that kind of thing. They're trying to any naysayers, they're trying to say, okay, that's not what we are at all. And then that way it makes them seem more positive. Also, it can counter stereotypes. So author Susan Cain has written a really famous book called Quiet, where she talks about how all the things that introverts are not that people think they are. So here she would say that introverts are not shy. And she gives an example. Bill Gates is introverted but not shy. He's quiet and bookish but isn't bothered by what other people think of him. And so then also we would have to define shy. So what does it mean to be shy? And there might be some misconceptions there too. So both introvert and shy would have to be classified there. And also she would say introverts are not antisocial. But then we'd have to define antisocial and introverts again, and then say introverts may prefer one-on-one interactions. And so that's a way that they're different from extroverts, but it doesn't mean that they're antisocial. So again, all of those things, definitions, and then they become argumentative because all of those things are debatable, right? So that's what we're kind of looking at in this specific week. And you'll be looking at some different articles that will kind of illustrate this and illustrate different approaches and strategies for using definition in argument. All right. Thank you.